My sister borrowed my identity to ruin my credit and marry my wealthy ex-fiancé, leaving me homeless. But when she accidentally invites me to her housewarming party, I reveal a secret from our childhood that proves she's been living a lie for 20 years. The steam rising from the industrial-sized vat of thin vegetable soup smelled like wet cardboard and broken promises. I held my plastic tray with both hands, my knuckles white and swollen from the early November chill. Behind the serving counter, a volunteer with a sympathetic smile ladled a graying broth into my bowl, her eyes skittering away from mine as if poverty were a contagious rash. I moved down the line, my boots, scavenged from a donation bin 3 months ago, squelching with every step. I found a seat at a wobbly folding table, surrounded by the low hum of people who had also been discarded by the world. It was here, in the dim light of St. Jude's basement, that I pulled a crumpled piece of paper from my pocket. It was a bank statement I had spent weeks trying to obtain, a paper trail of a life that was supposed to be mine. There it was, printed in elegant black ink. My name, my social security number, and a series of transactions for designer boutiques and luxury car payments. The person using my identity wasn't some shadowy hacker in a basement across the ocean. The signature on those mahogany desk checks had the same loopy and sharp I had seen on 1,000 high school homework assignments. My sister, Elena, had stepped into my skin and walked away with my world, leaving me to rot in the shadows of a life she had stolen. I remembered the day the floor fell out from under me. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing erosion. First, the credit cards were declined at the grocery store. Then came the frantic calls from debt collectors demanding payments for properties I had never visited and loans I had never signed for. I had called Elena, crying, looking for comfort. She had listened with a voice full of honey and false concern, telling me to stay calm while she handled things with her legal connections. I trusted her because we had shared everything. The same nursery, the same secrets, the same face. But while I was drowning in a financial abyss I couldn't explain, she was methodically cutting the safety lines. I found out later she had redirected my mail to a P.O. box and filed a change of address that effectively erased my existence from the grid. By the time I realized the call was coming from inside the house, my bank accounts were frozen, my apartment was under eviction notice, and my sister had vanished into the elite circles of the city, wearing my identity like a trophy. The most painful part of this theft wasn't the money or the credit score. It was Julian. Thinking of him felt like pressing a bruised rib. We had been engaged for 6 months, and our love felt like the only solid ground I had ever walked on. Julian came from a family of old money, the kind that lived in estates with names instead of addresses, but he was a man of simple kindness. We used to spend hours dreaming of a small cottage by the sea, away from the suffocating expectations of his mother. But as my life began to unravel, so did our relationship. Elena played her part with terrifying precision. She intercepted my letters to him, replacing them with forged notes that painted me as a woman who had only ever cared about his inheritance. She whispered in his ear that I was struggling with substance issues, and that I had asked her to keep him away for his own safety. While I was frantically trying to reach him, she was standing by his side as this supportive sister, slowly filling the void I had left behind. She didn't just steal my name, she stole the way he looked at me across a dinner table. One Tuesday, while the rain turned the city streets into a gray blur, I found myself standing outside a high-end newsstand, seeking a moment of shelter under the awning. A glossy fashion magazine had fallen from a delivery stack, its cover soaked and curled by the gutter water. I picked it up, intending to use it as a dry seat, but the image on the front stopped my heart. It was a photo of a high society gala. In the center stood a woman in a midnight blue silk gown, her arm looped firmly through Julian's. The caption read, "The elusive Sarah Vance and her fiancé, Julian Thorne, celebrating their upcoming nuptials." That was my name. That was my man. But the woman in the photograph was Elena. She was smiling with a polished, predatory grace, her hair styled exactly the way I used to wear mine. In that moment the cold didn't feel so sharp anymore. It was replaced by a white-hot clarity. I wasn't just a victim of bad luck or a failing economy. I was a ghost watching a parasite inhabit my future. The magazine turned to pulp in my hands, but the image stayed burned into my mind. I wasn't going to die in a soup kitchen. I was going to find a way back into that world, even if I had to burn it down to get there. Fate has a strange way of punishing the arrogant. A week later, I was visiting an old acquaintance, a woman named Martha who worked as a housekeeper for several wealthy families. She didn't know the full extent of my fall. I told her I was just between apartments. She handed me a thick cream-colored envelope that had been sent to an old address where she still worked. "This looked too fancy to throw away, Sarah," she said, oblivious to the bomb she was placing in my hands. It was a housewarming invitation mass-mailed to a list of socialites. Elena, in her rush to flaunt her new status, had used an outdated contact list from our father's old ledger. The party was being held at The Willows, the very estate Julian and I had toured together years ago. She was moving into the house I had picked out, decorated with the colors I had chosen, to live a life she hadn't earned. Her pride had made her sloppy. She thought I was long gone, buried under the weight of the debt she had saddled me with. She didn't realize that when you take everything from a person, you also take away their fear. I had 48 hours and $12 to my name. I walked into a local thrift shop, the kind where the air smells of mothballs and old dust. I spent hours sifting through the racks, looking for something that didn't look like a costume. I found a vintage black dress, simple and elegant, and a pair of heels that were a half size too small but polished up to a high shine. I used a pair of discarded sewing scissors to trim my hair into a sharp, sophisticated bob, the way I used to look before the streets took my pride. As I stared at myself in the cracked mirror of the shop's changing room, the woman looking back wasn't the beggar from the soup kitchen. She was the rightful owner of the name Sarah Vance. I wasn't going to that party to beg for my life back. I was going there to reclaim it. Elena thought she had built a fortress out of my identity, but she had forgotten one thing. A lie, no matter how beautiful, is still made of glass. I was ready to throw the first stone. The gravel of the long, winding driveway crunched beneath my thrift store heels, a sound that seemed loud enough to alert the entire estate to my intrusion. I didn't approach the front door where the valets were whisking away sleek European sedans. Instead, I circled toward the back, slipping through the service entrance near the rose garden. The moment I stepped inside, the air changed. It was thick and suffocating, a heavy mixture of stargazer lilies and the metallic tang of expensive perfume. This was the scent of the life I had planned, the very floral arrangements I had once pinned to a mood board before my world was systematically dismantled. I moved through the kitchen, keeping my head down, blending in with the frantic energy of the hired help. They were too busy plating smoked salmon and garnishing crystal flutes to notice a woman who looked like she belonged, yet possessed a gaze that was far too sharp for a guest. As I emerged into the grand foyer, the irony settled in my chest like a cold stone. I looked around at the vaulted ceilings and the crown molding, recognizing the exact shade of parchment white I had argued for years ago. Elena hadn't just stolen my identity, she had stolen my aesthetic, my dreams, and the very walls I was meant to grow old in. I drifted through the crowd of high society guests, women dripping in diamonds and men with voices like polished mahogany. They looked through me as if I were a ghost or a piece of the furniture. It was a strange, painful freedom, being a stranger in my own life. I watched Elena from a distance. She was standing near a marble fountain, laughing at something a senator said. She looked radiant, but to my eyes the radiance was a thin veneer. She was wearing a replica of our mother's heirloom pearls, a set I thought had been lost in the disaster that claimed our youth. Seeing them against her skin made my stomach churn with a renewed sense of purpose. I needed a moment to breathe, to steady my hands before the final confrontation, so I ducked into the library. It was a room I knew would be quiet, filled with the comforting smell of old leather and vanilla. But I wasn't alone. A man stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to me, staring out at the darkened lawn. My heart skipped a beat, then hammered against my ribs with terrifying force. It was Julian. He looked older, his hair dusted with silver at the temples, and his shoulders carried a heavy slouch that hadn't been there 2 decades ago. I tried to retreat, but the door creaked. He turned, his eyes narrowing as he took me in. For a second, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, a ghost of a memory, but I quickly lowered my head and tilted my chin, letting my new bob hide the profile he once loved. "The party is a bit overwhelming, isn't it?" he asked, his voice gravelly and weary. It wasn't the voice of a man in love. It was the voice of a man who had been tired for a very long time. I nodded, keeping my gaze on the carpet. "I was just looking for a moment of peace," I whispered, pitching my voice lower, raspy with a fake cold. He sighed, leaning against a mahogany desk. My wife, Sarah, she loves these things. She says it's important to maintain the family name. But sometimes I feel like I don't even know the woman I'm living with. She has this way of forgetting things. Simple things. Like the way she used to take her tea with 3 sugars and a slice of lemon. Now she drinks it black and claims she's always hated sugar. He chuckled softly, a hollow sound. Strange, isn't it? How 20 years can change someone so completely that they lose the very habits that made them who they were. My heart ached for him. Elena had never been able to mimic my small eccentricities. She was a master of the broad strokes but a failure at the fine details. He was living with a hollow imitation, and the weight of that realization was slowly crushing him. I excused myself before I could say something that would give me away, slipping back into the hallway. I followed the sound of a sharp hissed argument coming from the butler's pantry. Peeking through the cracked door, I saw Elena. The gracious hostess mask had slipped, revealing the jagged edges of her true personality. She was berating a young waitress for a smudge on a silver tray, her fingers twitching nervously against her silk skirts. "If you can't do this right, get out," she spat, her voice vibrating with an edge of hysteria. I noticed her eyes darting toward the door every time a guest laughed too loudly. She was terrified. Every person who walked through that door was a potential threat, a witness who might see through the facade. She wasn't just living my life. She was guarding it like a frantic thief in a house with no locks. She had spent 20 years building this gilded cage, and the stress of maintaining the lie was clearly eroding her sanity. It was the perfect opening. I reached into the hidden pocket of my black dress and felt the jagged edge of the small, charred object I had carried like a talisman. It was a wooden horse no larger than my palm, its legs burnt down to blackened stumps. This was the only thing I had managed to pull from the embers of our childhood home on that horrific night 20 years ago. Elena had told the world, and Julian, that I had been the one playing with candles, that my instability had caused the fire that destroyed our family's legacy. She used that lie to frame me as a liability, ensuring Julian would turn to her for protection while I was cast out. This little horse was the silent witness to her crime. It wasn't just a toy, it was proof of the fire she had set to cover up her first major theft. The wood was cold, but it felt like it was burning a hole in my hand, demanding to be seen. The music in the ballroom shifted to a slow, sweeping waltz. It was time. I walked toward the center of the room just as the servers began to distribute fresh glasses of champagne for the evening's main toast. Julian was being led to the small stage by Elena, who was beaming, her hand clamped tightly over his arm as if she were holding him captive. The guests gathered in a wide circle, their faces expectant and vapid. I moved through them like a shark through still water, positioning myself directly in Elena's line of sight, right beneath the central chandelier. I waited until the room fell silent, until Julian raised his glass to thank everyone for coming to their dream home. As he began to speak, I slowly lifted my head and looked directly at my sister. The transformation was instantaneous. I saw the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin the color of damp ash. The glass in her hand trembled so violently that the champagne spilled over the rim, soaking her white silk gloves. She didn't see a homeless woman or a disgruntled guest. She saw the girl from the fire, the woman she had tried to erase from existence. The air seemed to vanish from the room, a vacuum created by her sudden, gasping terror. For 20 years she had convinced herself I was a memory she had buried deep in the earth. But as I stood there, steady and silent, she realized the truth. The past doesn't stay buried. It waits for the right moment to come home. The silence that followed Julian's interrupted toast was heavy, like the air before a summer storm. Elena's hand was still shaking, the spilled champagne dripping from her white silk glove onto the marble floor with a rhythmic tap, tap, tap. I didn't wait for her to recover her voice. I took a single step forward into the light of the chandelier, my gaze steady on her pale, trembling face. I didn't scream. I didn't point a finger. Instead, I spoke with a quiet, grandmotherly clarity, the kind of voice that demands a room listen not through force but through truth. "It's a beautiful house, Elena," I said, the sound of her name echoing against the high ceilings. "It almost looks like the one we used to talk about when we were children. Do you remember?" The guests leaned in, their curiosity piqued by the sudden appearance of this uninvited woman who spoke with such terrifying familiarity. I began to tell a story, a fairy tale, about 2 sisters who lived in a house filled with history and old books. I described the night the history turned to smoke. Everyone thinks one sister was a hero that night, I continued, my voice never wavering. They think she pulled what was left of the family legacy from the flames while the other sister, the unstable one, watched it burn. But a hero doesn't strike a match to cover up the fact that the family bank accounts were already empty. A hero doesn't burn down a home just to hide the ledger that proves she had been stealing from her father for months. Elena's mouth opened, but only a dry, rattling gasp came out. You're confused, she stammered, her eyes darting toward the security guards at the edge of the room. Julian, this woman is unwell. She's one of those poor souls from the shelter. I didn't let her finish. I reached into the small, battered clutch I had carried and pulled out a stack of papers, yellowed by age and protected by plastic sleeves. I spent a long time being unwell in the eyes of the law because of you, I said. But while I was sleeping on park benches, I was also visiting county clerks' offices. I held up the first document so the guests closest to me could see the official seal. This is a death certificate, Julian. It's for Sarah Vance. It was filed 20 years ago in a small county 3 states away. Elena didn't just borrow my name. She legally murdered me so she could claim the inheritance our grandmother left specifically to me. She told the world I was dead so she could live my life without the fear of me ever coming back to claim it. I then pulled out the true centerpiece of my investigation. A small, soot-stained diary with a scorched leather cover. I had found it hidden in an old safety deposit box our mother had kept. One Elena had forgotten in her haste to become me. In our mother's own handwriting, she details the day she caught Elena forging our father's signature. She was going to confront you the very night the fire started. What a coincidence that the house burned down before she could speak. The room erupted into a frantic whisper. The high society guests, the people Elena had spent 2 decades trying to impress, were now recoiling from her as if she were a viper. Julian's reaction was the most devastating. He didn't erupt in anger. Instead, he seemed to physically shrink, his face aging 10 years in the span of 10 seconds. He looked at the woman he had called his wife, then back at me. He moved toward me, his hands trembling as he looked at my face. Really looked at it for the first time. He saw the way my eyes crinkled at the corners, a trait Elena could never mimic. He saw the small scar on my chin from a childhood fall we had shared. Sarah, he whispered, and the way he said my name broke my heart more than the last 20 years of poverty ever could. It was the sound of a man realizing his entire life was a lie. He looked at Elena's hand on his arm and recoiled, stepping away from her toward the empty space between us. The heartbreak in his eyes was my greatest revenge, but it felt like ashes in my mouth. He was seeing the ghost he thought he had lost, but we were both too haunted now to ever be whole again. Elena finally snapped. The polished veneer shattered completely as she lunged toward me, her face contorted in a mask of pure, ugly rage. You were supposed to stay gone, she shrieked, her voice cracking. I deserved this life. I worked for it. You were always the favorite, the golden child, and I was just the shadow. She turned to the guests, her eyes wild. Don't look at me like that. You all loved me yesterday. You loved my parties and my money. But the guests were backing away, their faces filled with disgust. The socialites she had cultivated, the people whose approval she had bought with my identity, were the first to turn their backs. She was no longer the queen of the manor. She was a common thief caught in the middle of a heist. The heavy front doors of the mansion swung open, and the rhythmic flash of blue and red lights began to pulse against the parchment-white walls. I had called the authorities before I even stepped onto the property, providing them with the file I had painstakingly assembled during my months of homelessness. 2 officers entered the ballroom, their boots echoing with a finality that silenced the room. They didn't go to the homeless woman in the thrift store dress. They walked straight to the woman in the midnight blue silk. As they read Elena her rights, she didn't fight anymore. She just stood there, her shoulders slumped, her expensive pearls looking like a noose around her neck. The wealthy life she had stolen was dissolving in real time, revealed as nothing more than a cheap, tawdry fraud. She looked at me one last time, and for a fleeting second, I saw the sister I had once loved. But that girl had died long before the fire. The woman being led away in handcuffs was a stranger who had spent 20 years wearing my skin. Julian tried to follow me as I turned toward the door. Sarah, wait, he called out, his voice thick with tears. We can fix this. I can make this right. The lawyers, the accounts. You can stay here. This is your house. I stopped at the threshold of the grand foyer and looked back at the sprawling, beautiful mansion. It was everything I had ever wanted when I was 25. But I was 50 now and I had learned that a home isn't built of marble and silk. No, Julian, I said softly. This house was built on a lie. Every time I looked at these walls, I'd see the fire. Every time I looked at you, I'd see the man who couldn't tell the difference between me and a shadow. I reached out and touched his cheek, a final goodbye to the life that could have been. I don't want your money and I don't want this house. I just wanted my name back. I walked out the front door, leaving the noise, the sirens, and the shattered remains of my sister's ambition behind me. The night air was crisp and clean, smelling of autumn leaves instead of lilies and smoke. As I reached the end of the long driveway, I took a deep breath. For the first time in 2 decades, my social security number belonged to me. My history was no longer a secret. I had no money in my pocket and no roof over my head for tonight, but as the sun began to hint at a new dawn over the horizon, I felt a lightness I hadn't known since childhood. I wasn't a victim and I wasn't a ghost. I was Sarah Vance and I finally had the credit to build a future that was entirely, authentically my own.